Hello, everyone. Namaskar, Adab. My name is Mimi Mondal, and I welcome you tonight to the inaugural DC South Asian Literary Festival on the behalf of DC South Asian Arts Council, a not for profit 501c3 organization based in Washington, D.C. This online festival is being held for an entire week from May 9th to May 15th. If you want to attend more panels in the next few days, please go to our website dcsaaci.org or the Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter handles of DCSAACI and find the schedule. So I want to start today with acknowledging what a precarious period this has been for organizing a literary festival. With the recent spike of the COVID-19 pandemic sweeping all over India, including many of our friends, families, loved ones, and often ourselves. So I would like to hold space for a second for the immense grief and loss all of us are feeling and we're together in. Right, so tonight's panel that I'm introducing is called Dalit Histories, Dalit Voices, and it's moderated by Dhanya Addanki. Dhanya is an editor, writer, oral historian, and photographer. She has spent her career training journalists and writers from marginalized backgrounds from all over the world. Her main points of interest are religion, human rights, identity, and liberation oriented journalism. She recently created an oral history archive for the South Asian American Digital Archive based in Philadelphia, and it's called An Altar to Dalit Honor. It explores how caste shows up in the South Asian diaspora. Dhanya was born in Andhra Pradesh, India, and raised in South Texas. So we are so happy and proud to have Dhanya bring her expertise as the moderator of tonight's panel. And now I will hand over to Dhanya, who will introduce our esteemed author panelist. Thank you so much.
Hi, everybody. Welcome. Thank you so much for being with us during this time. As Mimi said, it has been a tumultuous time for a lot of us with COVID and with everything happening globally. And I wanted to take a moment to thank the frontline health workers, the cremation workers, and everybody else that is doing their part with this pandemic. And I hope that you are all taking care of yourselves and extending some of that care to others as well. I'm very excited to introduce today's panelists, some of the most talented writers and speakers, if you ask me. We have Christina Dhanraj, who is a writer, consultant, advisor, and co-founder of the Dalit History Month Project. We have Dr. Roja Singh, who is an author of Spotted Goddess, Dalit Women's Agency, Narratives on Caste and Gender Violence, and an assistant professor of interdisciplinary studies, anthropology, sociology, and women and gender studies. And we also have Dr. Sundar John Boopalan, who is the author of Memory, Grief, and Agency, a political theological account of wrongs and rights, and an assistant professor at Canadian Mennonite University in Winnipeg, Canada. I just want to take this time to welcome the three of you here, and we're so glad that you're here. Hi, everyone. Thank you again for being here. And I think the first question that I have for you all is I want to hear a bit more about your writing journey. You all have books that you've written, you, Roja, with Spotted Goddess, and John with Memory, Grief, and Agency, and Christina, the book that you're currently working on, which we're all excited to hear about. I want to hear more about the inspiration behind that writing and what the personal journey has been. I know that a lot of the books that you've written and are working on now are deeply personal and are tied deeply to your histories and to your identities. And I want to talk about that journey a little bit and see, where the inspiration came from and what that journey has been like for you. And I'd love to start with Roja. Can you talk a little bit about that?
I said, are we going with the oldest person? Anyway, that's okay. That's okay. I'll start off, and then I think we can start building on one another's dreams and journeys, I think. And I think when you speak about a life journey, when you speak about a writer's journey, when you speak about a Dalit journey, right? and a spiritual journey. To me personally, they're all so intricately woven with one another, because I think when we speak of, inclusion in terms of, okay, so these are the various ideas, these are the various thoughts, concepts, theories that I am looking into, that I'm including, right, in my concept, in my understanding of who I am. I realized that inclusion is a little different from relationship. So I had to actually build a relationship with theories and concepts that were already out there. And I have always been a big fan of African American writing and literatures, and which has been a huge inspiration for me, especially, starting with Zora Neale Hurston, speaking, right, speaking the language, and to say, like, we speak different, right? So do you have a problem with that? So uh, that journey, I would say, really started there for me, being exposed to a lot of African American women claiming their identity and celebrating the female, the Black female identity. So then I realized that, okay, so inclusion is different from relationships. So I'm going with relationship, right? So I had to really build close relationships with authors, right? With authors who I felt deeply connected to, even somebody like Gloria Anzaldúa. I mean, to just understand her, to engage with her, to just like live, right? Live with these authors, in my mind, in my thought, in my emotions, was very important to me. And then as I started realizing that, I do have a passion, right, for literature, I do have a passion for writing, I do have a passion to think about where do women's journeys actually lead them, right? Where do they start? Do they actually end? What is the beginning, middle, and end of these journeys, and so on? And that is when I was exposed to Dalit culture and identity. And I'm shameful to say that I grew up in India for over 26 years, not realizing, right? So the existence of Dalit communities and the crises and the struggles that Dalit communities are in. And so when I was exposed to that later on in life in 1991, after I married and moved to a village, and that is where I started really understanding what it means to build relationships. So that's why the journey, the seed of writing that actually started several years ago, I would say, like, 20 years ago, right? It took me such a long time to really write this book because I wanted to spend time in really soaking myself in these relationships, right? So really absorbing the affection, really absorbing the organic sort of affection, the organic lifestyles, the organic thought patterns, the organic singing, the organic rhythms, the lyrical narratives. I really had to like soak myself in it. And I don't think I've soaked myself in it enough even now. But I really want to do that, right? So centering my book around Dalit oral narratives, Dalit women's claim to who they are. Basically, we are reclaiming, right? Reclaiming our identity now because of the fact that there were so many platforms in which we've been misrepresented, starting with, with the dominant Hindu scriptural narratives that we associate with Hinduism, unfortunately. So for thousands of years, if we have been misrepresented in dominant narratives, I think I felt a huge responsibility because when I actually started becoming interested in Dalit studies and Dalit oral narratives, there was nothing out there. There was nothing. There was like zero. There was like vacuum that I had to start from. And I mean, Sati Clark had done some work with the theological aspect of the Dalit drum and so on. So it was very, very difficult for me. So I had to really rely on the few resources that I had. And but I was very lucky to have, very blessed to have the resource of the women themselves, from the earth, from the soil. And so I just couldn't back off, right? So it's like it's addictive. more and more and more. And so therefore it took me several years to actually weave this book and put everything together, because I really wanted, on the one hand, yes, I really wanted on the one hand to show the world that we are breaking kind of like the masterminded craftsmanship of the social construction of Dalit identity, right? Specifically of Dalit women. And we know that race, okay, we can say racism is a socially learned behavior, we can say sexism is a socially learned behavior, but who's teaching it, right? So where is it being taught? And so those kind of teaching platforms is what we want to break, right? We want to really demythologize, those kinds of spaces, because the purpose for my writing, if I put it in a few words, is that I really wanted to break the myth out there that Dalit women are passive victims. So the women that I engaged with and continue to engage with are women who are challenging the system, who are resilient, who have turned their differences and their stigmatizations into tools of change, right? So subverting those differences into tools of change. So that's the story I wanted the world to hear, because the media, of course, will say, oh, so many women were affected, which is not to say that I'm nullifying those experiences, no, but basically I really wanted to show the world that Dalit women are strong, right? That they are brave, that they are courageous. And even though Dalit, I think Dalit writing is a space of profound vulnerability, definitely, which goes along, with the idea of power. I think vulnerability and power are closely connected. To see how these women are risk takers, right, making themselves vulnerable. And for me, as a writer, as a person who is in relationship with these women, I was deeply influenced by that vulnerability, right? So there is a lot of disagreements, right, within their communities, within their families, but there is a courage to respond to that situation rather than react. And I think that's what really drew me a lot to that wielding of that power, that innate capacity, right? That innate efficiency to bring about social change as agents of social change. And to see that was deeply, deeply inspiring for me. And I was like, it would have been a crime in my mind if I didn't write about it. So I felt that sense of responsibility that I have to really show the world, right? So to show the world that Dalit women speak different, Dalit women act different. If you have a problem with it, you need to get help.
Thank you so much, Roja. John, how about you? What has your journey been like? I know that Roja brought up a lot of deep and interesting topics, so I'm curious about what your journey has been like.
Thanks, Dhanya, for asking that, and thanks, Akka. I'll call you Roja so people don't get confused what Akka means in Tamil, which is elder sister. But I really think you are really like an elder sister in the community, and there are so many resonances with what I am here. What I'm thinking. So when I'm hearing you, I guess the viewers already saw me nodding my head like this because there's so many resonances, right? The first thing that comes to, I'll say two things in terms of what I heard, and then I respond to the question more specifically. The first thing that comes to mind is what Roja said about entering this network of relationships, right? That when Dalits enter the writing process, we are entering a network of relationships of people who have gone before us, told their stories, inspired us, and sparked our imagination, right? So that's just one thing. The second thing that I was kind of drawn towards as Roja was speaking was how she describes her own Dalit journey as kind of coming to age in this around like 26 years or so, right? And that's my story too, right? It's my story too. It was not until like after my undergraduate education that I began to say, I am Dalit, right? And it's not that I did not know. Right? So I have a mixed caste identity, right? Today I say proudly I am Dalit. My father is Dalit. He comes from the Parayar community. My mother comes from a dominant caste community, right? So growing up, we knew that about our family, but it wasn't until after my undergraduate education, during theological education, right? I won't say too much about that now because I want to talk about that a little later in conversation. It was only in a Christian theological educational institution that I came to have a sense of, oh my God, there is so much violence around us, and Dalit communities continue to suffer extreme violence, right? And to therefore say I am Dalit was just revolutionary for myself, right, Dhanya? So that brings me to your very particular question, and I'll say very quickly one or two things, and I'll stop. I'm looking forward to hearing what Christina has to say here. Is historically, right? Historically, in the Indian context, three things happened to Dalits, and I want to name these three things with respect to the writing process, right? One is that Dalits were written out of history. And that is simply because, viewers have probably heard this a million times, this fourfold Varna order, the story of origin in which Dalits do not have a place, right? But that importantly meant that Dalits did not have access to education, because access to education was through access to Hindu scripture. So when Dalits did not have that, they were written out of history, right? So the first thing is, in terms of Dalit history, Dalit voices, Dalits were written out, right? And I want to name a second thing, which is that Dalits were written off, right? Dalits were written off, as if Dalit voices don't have anything to contribute to the imagination that we collectively share as human persons, right? Therefore, Dalits were written off. And I'd say that also works in the present continuous process, that Dalits are still written off, right? But that's a tension between were written off and are written off, which brings me to my third point, which is Dalits today are written about quite a lot, right? Mm-hmm. Now the Dalit topics are trending now, right? Dalit topics are trending. Dalits are trending now. So there's a lot of writing about Dalits, right? Now, when we Dalits write about ourselves, right, it's a beautiful thing. It's a revolutionary thing. It feels different. It sounds different. It reads different. So those are my first thoughts to that question, right? And I'll just name one emotion that I felt when when around 26, I kind of came to my sense of, oh my God, to say I am Dalit is a beautiful thing. But what it did to me was, it didn't bring about shame necessarily, but it brought about a lot of anger. Anger that we continue to live in a society that is so violent, and somehow that is not captured in the text that we read, right? So my predominant emotion at that point, as I started writing, was anger. But written out, written off, written about, but now we are writing, and it's a beautiful, beautiful thing. Let me stop there.
Absolutely. And speaking about writing,
thank you, John.
Yeah, thank you, John. I know, Christina, you're working on a writing project, which I can't wait to read. You're a brilliant writer. I'm just curious, we've heard from two brilliant people that have written works, but as you are working on your project now, I would just love to know a little bit more about your journey. And if you want to respond to anything that Roja and John said, please feel free to do that.
Sure. Just wow. I mean, to be part of this shared space with Rojaka and you and John is I think is revolutionary in and by itself, right? I don't think this has happened before. So I think it's an understatement to say that I consider this a privilege and an honor to just be able to, share this space and share what I feel, and to have this kind of communion. Pardon the Christian terminology, but to be able to have this kind of a sharing of our journeys as to what has really led us here. Although it is quite a trying time back home. My journey essentially began with reading, and so I go back to the habit that my mother inculcated in us, and back then I felt like it was the simplest of interventions that a parent can do, like just give books to your child, to get her to a library. I remember as a kid, I used to go to bed so excited because the next morning my sister and I would have planned to go to the local lending library to just borrow a few books. But in retrospect, I sit back and I think, what a revolutionary thing to do, to be middle class, to be lower middle class, to not have, to have just that much money for your livelihood, and have really tight sort of situations to manage, and to give that money out and to invest that in your children's reading pleasures. She would go to the extent of buying a Russian comic magazine called Misha. I don't know if you guys remembered it, for 30 rupees. So to me, when I look back at that, I owe my writing process, I owe my journey to that habit that my mother started in me. And so that's where it essentially began. And then eventually I moved on from comics and all of that into American fiction, pulp fiction, nonfiction, all kinds of genres. And then I finally ended up reading Indian fiction, the likes of Jhumpa Lahiri, and South Asian fiction, the likes of Jhumpa Lahiri and Arundhati Roy and Chitra Divakaruni. And what I noticed was this absence of women like me. And in that sense, it was somewhat similar to the journey that Rojaka was talking about, that it took so long. I kind of resonate with that. Like, this literature is not readily available for any of us, literature that is written by our people. And so we have to go through these long journeys through several other kinds of genres and literature before we kind of discover that niche, that place where we belong in that writing world. So that's essentially what happened to me. I went through Indian fiction. I found that these fiction had protagonists of women who I could not relate to. And that thirst led me to Bama. Again, Bama's writing is something that moved me so powerfully. And finally, I was able to see myself in her writing. I felt like there is this literature that spoke to me, that spoke to my existence, that I could resonate with. And that's precisely the feeling that's driving me in my work today as well towards this book that I'm writing, is that there is so much of us that's happening, that has happened in terms of writing, not just as in the form of books, but also in all kinds of writing, right? Essays, in the kind of articulation that we are doing today as a panel, and in the kind of conversations that we've had within our families. It is so rich, it is so diverse, and it is so huge. And yet what gets spotlighted is just one or two pieces of fiction, and that ends up representing 350 million or so of us. And to me, that's unfair. That's ultimately quite unfair. And I want to be able to change that, not just as an individual, but as someone who's part of a collective, who's building a body of work so diverse and so on your face that my next generation, that my child will not be able to have the same experience that I did, that they would be able to readily be able to access Dalit literature, whether it's nonfiction, whether it's fiction, whether it's theological. I do consider theological writing as a completely separate sort of genre. And, whatever that is, like, I want that to be so readily available and so much that we don't have to go searching for it, that we don't have to go discover it. And that's the emotion that's essentially driving me through my work. And that's been my journey as well. And I'm really hoping that when my piece comes out, it won't just be in solo. It won't just be the solo book that gets kind of celebrated in a way that, we have this new Dalit writer, but it would be among many other people as well who are writing different aspects of their lives, different aspects of their diverse lives.
I think that's amazing. And I think a lot of what you all talked about was specifically about filling in these gaps, right? There's this whole body of work and we were written out of it, and there are so many gaps that we need Dalit writers to fill. And I think the three of you are doing a brilliant job of doing that. And I'm wondering, I think we answered this a little bit in the first question, but I think storytelling from a Dalit perspective, from a marginalized perspective, is very different from any different other types of storytelling. And I'm wondering if you all could talk to a little bit about how does storytelling from the Dalit perspective, from filling in these gaps and from working mainly in these constraints and having to learn so much without having access to a lot of this knowledge. I'm wondering, how does storytelling from the Dalit perspective differ from more privileged identities? And I think we could start with you, John. That would be great.
Oh, sure, Dhanya. Thanks. I was not quite ready for that, but sure, I'll start here. Right. I think it's really different, right, Dhanya? It's very, very different. And maybe two things come to mind. One, I'll start with the story, right? This is the story of origin, right? The first one, my guess is everybody's heard of the first one, where, okay, some people come from God's head, some people come from God's, hand, some people come from God's thighs and feet and whatnot. And Dalits don't have a place in that story, right? This is the written out part of writing, right? And then Dalit poets have always responded to this, right? Like the poet Gaddar, for instance, say, oh, you say you come from the head and, hands and thighs and feet. But, we Dalits, we come from where all human persons come from, right? And we all know where human persons come from, right? So in that sense, I think this is the difference when Dalits write our stories. We have a sense of what, Roja would call earthy in her book, right? That we have the sense of being grounded in reality, right? So that's the first thing that comes to mind, just being grounded in the earth, in reality, in what's happening. Right. The second thing that comes to mind, and this is the last thing I'll say, and I'll stop, is that there is no place for oppression. Oppression of any kind cannot and will not be rationalized in Dalit writing. Right. Now, sometimes we'll read stuff that one of my favorite American words is gaslighting. Right, that's just one of my favorite American words, because sometimes when we read writing, sometimes they have a way of rationalizing injustice and oppression. In Dalit writing, that's not going to happen, right? Those are the two things that I'd say probably stop there. Yeah.
How about you, Christina? What are your thoughts? How do you think it's different from your perspective?
Well, I do resonate with John, particularly in the first point when you say, grounded in the earth. I see that as being grounded in lived experience. Like, I haven't come across literature, and by that I mean not just books, but all kinds of storytelling where the author's Dalit lived experience does not reveal itself in some way or the other. And I feel like most Dalit writers come from that place of having that grounded experience. They don't just talk in imagination. They don't imagine oppression, if I can say that. Different ways of oppression, but that is very much grounded. That's very much personal. That's very much in their lives or in their families' lives. It's not imagined. It's not observed. It's not coming from an outsider's perspective. It's coming from an insider's perspective. So that's something that I feel like is markedly different when it comes to Dalit writing. The second thing that I feel is different is that I have not come across Dalit writers or Dalit writing that is similar to for example, the likes of Arundhati Roy's God of Small Things, or the Ministry of Utmost Happiness, or for that matter, even Rohinton Mysteries, A Fine Balance, where you see a certain type of, for want of a better word, a certain entitlement that these authors feel entitled enough to imagine another's oppression, or to be able to speak on behalf of their subject. Like Rohinton Mystery would go at length about two Dalit people struggling and suffering. Like, he does not hesitate in talking on behalf of them, you know. But on the other hand, when Dalit writers write, it's mostly autobiographical. They're talking about themselves, right? So we don't take that much of a freedom, or that we don't feel entitled enough to speak on behalf of another person or speak on behalf. We only talk about oppression in relation to us, or we talk about oppressors in relation to the oppression that they cause us, but we don't necessarily talk on behalf of them, right? So I think that that bit of nuance also comes from a place of privilege. Like if you are a non-Dalit person, if you are of an upper caste location, you are privileged enough to feel that you can write that, while Dalits don't necessarily can afford that privilege. Yeah.
Absolutely. Roja, is there anything that you'd like to add?
And have a whole day conference just on this aspect of storytelling, right? Who can tell whose story, right? So very often, listening to what, so like Christina said, yes, we tend to look at non-Dalits writing about Dalits as a certain kind of audacity, right? So who gave you the permission, right, to do this kind of an attitude that we have? But I think I struggle with that. I go with both and. There are certain writers I do agree that I do have a problem with in terms of, for example, Gayatri Spivak. I have a total problem with her. What gives you the right to talk about the subaltern, right? What gives you the right to claim or to even, be in a space like American academia and claim your space of marginalization there, right? It's ridiculous. It's so ironical. So that is audacity, right? So, and I think Maheshwara Devi also she had a problem with that as well, right? Spivak representing all of these issues. But on the other hand, I do sort of resonate, right? I differ with Christina a little bit on that, because I do resonate with certain writers who I feel are not writing on behalf of, but I see as writing with or writing alongside, right? So I think in my later years now, I'm realizing that yes, Dalit storytelling is innate. It is in us. It is inherent. It is inherent in any indigenous community, any native community, right? Storytelling is a part of who you are. I'm reading a book on Zen, and it talks about how waves are the practice of water, right? So therefore, I look at storytelling, lyrical narratives, singing, dancing, which are all part of storytelling, um, as inseparable. To look at waves as separate from water is a delusion, because waves have, water having waves is in a spectrum, right? Every body of water, whether it twice, it's still or not, there are waves. There is a spectrum. So in the same way, I feel like we cannot separate Dalit culture or any kind of indigenous culture, where especially women, right, play a prominent role from storytelling. That's who we are. That's inherent, right? And so, being of that mind of a storyteller, you cannot but have a restless mind, right? So therefore, Dalit stories, I feel, I agree with Christina on that, have that unique capacity to disturb you, right? It provokes you, and it causes a certain sense of restlessness. And so if there is a mind that we think is calm and at peace, that's a delusion, because being disturbed, being restless, being pushed out of your comfort zone, sort of gurgling within yourself, is an amplified state of mind. That is an active mind, and that is what really comes out as these powerful stories that we hear from women, because it is unadulterated, right? It's just pure form of voice, pure form that just like flows, right? And at some point in my book, I call them like splatter narratives. It's like, I'm using the image of the Dalit woman sort of using that big mortar and pestle to grind the dal, right? and some of it, splatters. It comes out, and that's a natural process, but it required an effort that is putting its energy towards something else. But these things effortlessly sort of fall out, and I think that effortlessness, that spontaneity, is very unique and integral. And I think I will say that I'm in a privileged place, right, with my education and so on. So storytelling by writers who have been privileged with formal education is very different from the stories that we hear, from Dalit. And that's what I love about, Bhamaka's writing as well, because she just gives you the raw material, right? It's just who she is. It's just who she grew up with, right? And she cannot but help but do that. Anything else would be pretension. So I think that unpretentious writing, the truth telling, is very integral to Dalit writing.
Yeah,
and story.
absolutely. I think accessibility is something that we are all very interested in. And I don't think we write from ivory towers. We want to make sure that the things that we're writing are accessible and anybody that is from our community can understand and see themselves in that story and feel a little less alone. I think that what I'm hearing has been the goal for a lot of the writing. I want to shift the conversation a little bit and talk about religion. I think it's important to talk about that, especially with the identities of every panelist here. I realize that you're all Dalit Christian people, and a lot of the themes in your writing I've noticed are tied to liberation and agency in a way that's very different from how a lot of people and a lot of Dalit Christian people in general are taught about Christianity and religion. And I'm curious about what the journey has been. Again, a question about journey. What the journey has been when it comes to Christianity and your writing. I'd love for you to talk a little bit about what that has been like for you, if it has moved and shaped the way that you write and the way that you think, or if it hasn't at all. And I'd love to start with you, Christina.
So I want to start off with this thing about my grandfather, who was a pastor of the Church of South India. And as a kid, I remember he used to have a bookshelf in the house, like whichever church that he was posted to, there would be a bookshelf there. And one of my favorite activities was to go steal a book from that bookshelf. And so my sister and I, we would be like, when Tata goes away, we need that asset. Like, please, Tata, we don't want your land, like however little that you own. Like, we don't want your house or whatever. Just give us the books, So I see that experience. I see that. I look back at that and I think, like, to be able to, to be able to think of that possibility, to be able to have that possibility even of owning a personal library in your own house was huge for me. And I grew up my Tata reading these books and preparing his sermons and preaching these. And I remember my mom and my dad not just reading the Bible every day, but also reading a lot of para-biblical literature that came along with it, historical literature even, and then analyzing it, thinking about it, discussing it. So I feel like I was put in a culture where learning, analyzing, thinking, all of this was so part of that thing, that process. And I didn't know that then. But now that you ask me this question, Dhanya, now that I think about it, I feel like all of that kind of really worked up to the writer that I am. The fact that I was reared in that culture of learning, of thinking, of being cerebral, even within the confines of my religion, even within the confines of my spirituality, somehow trained me in my writing as well. Right. Another example that I would like to give is, and John, pardon me, you would have already heard me say, talking about this at length, is the student Christian movement. so my writing is deeply connected to my politicization. At least my more recent writing is deeply connected to my politicization. And my politicization happened within the student Christian movement, which is a Christian context, which is very much an ecumenical organization that believed that we have to talk about faith, spirituality, and all of that, but also have an understanding of your social realities and become a person who can respond to those social realities, right? So I feel like if for this space, if for this very Christian space, I would not have been politicized because I did not have access to Ambedkar, because schools hardly teach about Ambedkar, because we grew up in Christian families. Your politicization does not necessarily happen similarly to that of Ambedkarite families, fully open Ambedkarite families. So in a way, I would have completely lost out. And I'm so grateful. Again, in retrospect, I did not know what a massive intervention it was to not only be part of a space like that, but to meet people like John and meet people like Rojaka, Dalit feminists and Dalit theologians, who completely flipped the way I saw spirituality and religion and God and justice and faith. And I think all of this essentially made me the person that I am, but also the writer that that I have become and I'm going to be when I do finish this book, right? So I definitely owe a lot to my Christian upbringing and the spaces that I've been part of, which wasn't just church, which wasn't just the church, which wasn't just spiritual, and which wasn't just quote unquote very, very Christian and very fundamentalist in its view.
Thank you so much, Christina.
Yeah.
John, I would love to hear your thoughts on this question about religion and writing.
Thanks, Dhanya, and thanks, Christina, for saying and sharing that story. I think that there's a lot to be said here, right? I'm looking at the time; it is flying. There's so much to say about each of these things, right? I want to, like Christina, right? Like Christina, I have to talk about my father, right? My Dalit father. We grew up in a church context that is popularly called the Bhakt Singh assemblies. And in the Bhakt Singh assemblies, one of the things that you'll see people do is that we always carry around our Bibles, right? We always carry around our Bibles. And for me, I always saw my father do that, right? And everybody in the Bhakt Singh assembly do that. Now, that kind of thing it has two elements of significance for me. One is just the symbolism of the written text, right? That you hold the written text in your hand. It's a symbol of power, of empowerment, of liberation, right? On the other hand, my father also inspired me because he really loved writing. He loved the writing of the Bible. He loved that religion. And he loved just religious books. And he would speak at length about literature, right? I always saw my father reading. And that was very deeply, deeply inspiring for me. But I think the last thing I'll say about religion and writing is also, I think religion and writing is a tricky kind of subject because sometimes religion justifies oppression rather than empower and liberate, right? So it's this very interesting kind of bind that religion and literature find themselves in, right? So that's the other thing that I'll say. So for me, I have always rejected parts of religious literature that justify oppression and do not speak about liberation. That includes also pieces of Christian literature, right? So maybe that's I'll say that and I'll stop there, I think. Yeah.
Roja, any thoughts?
I have so much to say, I said, and thank you so much, Christina and John. And I think there is our umbilical cord, common umbilical cord that's like connecting all of us, I think, in this experience, right, of our ancestors choosing to become Christian and what pushed them to do that. When they did that, it was very important for them to do it because more than a religious conversion, I I strongly believe it was a social statement that they were making, and it was a very bold move, right? Just imagine like pushing against the norm and saying, I'm going to embrace this new religion that is being, sort of presented to me, right? Um, I mean, and we all know the metaphor of the great wheel that is used in, so many cultural sort of narratives and so on. It's like we return to where, or things must always return to where they were, right? And I mean, Oscar Wilde has written about it and so on. So to break that cycle and say, I don't need to return to where I was, right? I'm going to choose a different path was a very brave move, or it was a very courageous move, definitely. But why, right? But why? And I think one of the things that people criticize about Dalit Christians is that, the missionaries kind of like dangled, these things of food and education and so on. I'm like, okay, did you dangle it for us? You took everything away from us, right? And like you guys were pointing out, everything was taken away from us, and we were not even considered to be human beings. And so here is somebody who's coming and saying, hey, those people are not letting you inside their temple, the temples that you have built for them, slogged, right? But here we are for you, and we are going to build churches for you. We're going to build worship spaces for you, and presenting that as an acceptable, a space that is accepting rather than rejecting was huge, right? And then education is huge. Who wouldn't grab education when for thousands of years you've been said you cannot be in the space of education? So therefore, the Christian missionary movement, all the women in India, irrespective of whether you are Brahmin or a Dalit woman, is grateful to or should be grateful to the Christian missionary movement in India, because without that, even women wouldn't have received education, right? So that is definitely there. And but like John pointed out, there are these both and aspects to anything, and I think any kind of institutionalized religion is problematic, right? And any kind of fundamental form of religion is problematic. Any kind of politicized ways of religion is problematic, and that's why we find the political version of Hinduism is problematic. The political version of Christianity, if you read the Doctrine of Discovery, what did Christianity do to Native Americans? And then I'm ashamed to say that I'm a Christian, right? Because there is that history there, right? So then I need to be very thoughtful in the way I'm critiquing another religion, where I have now, I'm now kind of like sitting right on the cushion, so figuratively and literally speaking, that my ancestors have gained from Christian missionaries, right? So I struggle with that a lot, and so Bama writes about that, right? She says how Christianity did a lot of disservice, right? Even though she does acknowledge receiving education, but Christian priests in her village basically, told the Dalit women and others that they cannot do this, they cannot do that, otherwise they're going to hell, right? You cannot divorce, you cannot do. So that kind of liberation she felt like was in a way taken away that that Dalits had before they converted to Christianity. But I find it problematic today when I read, the kinds of litanies that are in our prayer books and so on that we use in the churches. I mean, the language is basically telling the Dalits that, I'm a sinner, right? So I'm unworthy of even receiving the crumbs under your table. Like, why would you make a person who's already suffering and being tortured say that? So we really need to contextualize these things and self-critique, right? I mean, I'm thank you. Like I studied in MCC as well, and student Christian movement is it did great for a lot of people, but I tended to really stay away from it for me, because in my generation at that time, I felt it was really, being judgmental, right? And I did not want to be judgmental on my Muslim friends, on my Hindu friends, I'm very uncomfortable with self-righteousness. So we can't do that. So I think as I'm getting older, I'm learning how do we really critique, right? This Christian religion that meant so much to my parents, to my grandparents, right? And I don't want to let go of it, but I can be a part of a reformation, right, within it. Like how a lot of Hindus are struggling as well, right? They don't want the caste identity and the caste, associations of Hinduism. Can I still be a Hindu, right? Can I still call myself a Hindu because that faith meant something to my ancestors? So my Christian faith meant a lot to my ancestors. So I'm struggling a lot with that in this particular, phase of my life. But like Christina said, it meant a lot to our ancestors, and both my parents grew up, went to Christian boarding schools, and for them, missionaries were like gods. And so we need to really take that into account because, on the other hand, my grandfather, after becoming, Christian and being associated with the white folks, he was very proud to like walk beside the white people, who would put, their arms around his shoulder. And for my mom to sit and have a conversation with white women when she couldn't have a conversation with, other women other than her Dalit, community meant a lot to her. It really was a boost to them. I think one of you said that the Bible was probably the only book that was in their house, the only book that they held in their hand. They couldn't read or write, but here's a book, right? Somebody gave them a book. That was amazing. Like John said, Dalits were written off and we were not there. We were not present. But for somebody to recognize that and give people a book was important for them. So for my grandfather, walking alongside white Christian missionaries meant a lot. But my cousin, one of my cousins who was like 85, actually told me that my grandfather then later on adapted the same mindset as a dominant caste person because after his generation, during his generation, becoming Christian and having access to education, being a teacher, having been able to own land and build a home, you start feeling superior to those Dalits who don't have that. And I observed that in Karunguri, the village where I lived in, that the Christian educated Dalits would treat the uneducated poor farmer Dalits in the congregation as servants, and that hurt me a lot. And so I do write about that, and I want to write more about it, but I don't want to take up too much time now. But that's what I'm struggling with right now. It is important that our ancestors converted to Christianity; they did the right thing. But what is Christianity doing to us right today? What versions of Christianity are out there?
Right. I think that tension and that struggle is something that we should all be thinking about and moving forward as we talk about liberation for communities and as we talk about what writing and liberation and religion have to do with our own histories and stories. We are running out of time, so I would love to get some audience questions. There is one at the bottom, and it says, I'm grateful for the work all of you do and ask for book recommendations to increase my awareness and connection to my family's Dalitness that they work to get beyond as immigrants. So are there any book recommendations? I will say one book recommendation from each panelist.
I'm just going to say the obvious because I can't think of a book that can help someone increase their connection is to just go for Annihilation of Caste by Dr. B.R. Ambedkar. It's like the most basic literature that anyone has to educate themselves with. Yeah.
Oh, I would recommend John's book, which I think grapples with a lot of these, these questions about, contradictions that are out there, and he gives us so many tools that are very spiritually renewing in terms of moving away from that, from that sense of, grief and loss, due to memory, in terms of, yes, that is there, but then, I always go back to this idea of stolen generations that the Aboriginal communities went through. But yes, we are a stolen generation, right? In terms of so much was stolen from us. But there are, these resources like John provides for us, and like Sati Clark's book also, Palmer's book, what Evangeline Rajkumar writes about as well. Dalit Theology in the 21st Century is a very good collection of Dalit writings. How do we, really grasp, right? Grasp, the roots, whether it is for climbing up or whether it is to get deeper, right, into who we are. So yeah, I would recommend John's book a lot, and waiting for Christina's book. So.
Thank you, Roja. How about you, John? I love that there's so much knowledge here and we're recommending each other's books.
That's going to be my recommendation, right? Bama's Karuku is just fantastic. I have both editions here, but since you asked for one, I'm going to say Bama's Karuku is excellent.
Absolutely.
I have one last question for everybody to end on more of a hopeful note. I think in my oral history interview with Mimi Mundo, who is the host of this panel, she talked a lot about brutal realities and writing about brutal realities. And with everything happening right now, with the violence against so many of our communities, with the way that COVID is ravaging a lot of South Asia, I'm wondering, how do you balance writing about those brutal realities that are very present and need to be talked about, but also thinking about hope for a future where Dalit people can be free, where we can have that freedom and have that imagination to think about what that freedom looks like and build on that imagination to make it a reality for generations to come. Yeah, I'm just wondering what that balance looks like, if you can answer in one or two sentences, since we're out of time. I did want to end on a more hopeful note as we leave the audience. But yeah, how do you balance writing about those brutal realities while still thinking about and using that radical imagination to imagine a world in the future where the people are free? Roja, we can start with you.
Yeah, quickly. So there is, I believe there is something called mind weeds, right? So one of my mind weeds that I really struggle with, because it grows so fast, right? And so beautifully and so, skillfully, is this particular thing about, balancing between objectivity, subjectivity, right? It becomes a huge problem, because there are multiple ways and multiple means in which we self-regulate what we actually write, what we want to present, what we want to engage with. But it is tiresome. You guys will agree. It is tiresome. It's mental energy, it's emotional energy, intellectual energy, relational energy, physical. It's tiresome. But what you actually see is that this kind of restlessness that I talk about, that I write about, this kind of desire for social change among Dalit women and Dalit communities, and for them to be able to rise above, right, like Maya Angelou's poem, to rise above the state of victimization, in coming out to tell their stories, and even in their death, right, like the Hafez, right? There are stories that are being told by them, and their voices are present even when they're physically absent, right? These bodies are physically absent. So that in itself is a strength. So I think these struggles change in self-nourishment at a certain point. It depends on the reader. I think it depends, of course, how you present these stories. But I believe that in my mind, there is a self-awareness that just happens in the process of writing. I grew so much in that process of writing, right? So in that process of writing, you are able to really look for, these kinds of creativity, the audacity of Dalit women presenting it in such a beautiful, spectrum of light, like Bama does also, like rebellious women who like, lift up their clothes and, things like that to silence oppressive structure. So that's the positivity. That's the power.
Thank you so much, Roja. Christina, how about you?
I'm just going to read out what I've written here. So partly because I want to finish it earlier. So in many ways, and I don't say this prescriptively, but descriptively, trauma and pain have given way to beauty, a complexity that is almost pristine. I see that as a way of healing, a path we must all take as writers, whose journeys are as personal as it is collective, that in writing, in producing, and creating a body of work, we will be able to imagine a future that is joyful and vibrant, that in so doing, word becomes life, if not today, then someday soon.
That was beautiful. Thank you so much, Christina. John, how about you?
Thanks, Roja and Christina. The thought that comes to my mind is, when you read Bama's Karuku, for instance, right, my book recommendation, you'll see two things going on in Bama, and those will be the two things I simply repeat as being inspired by Bama here. One is there's a lot of joy. There's a lot of joy. There's a lot of eating and laughing and socializing, being in each other's company and presence, and just simply being human, right? To just walk free, to be free without fear of being subject to violence. It's that kind of joy that drives writing, right? At the same time, there is also the recognition, and I'm glad that Roja mentioned Hathras, and I know Christina has written about that for Outlook. Sometimes people find Dalit writing inspiring, but like Christina says, it's also very tiring. It's exhausting to write about pain and wrongs, and yet we do, because the imagination that drives us is that imagination, right? Is that desire to be free, to laugh, to eat, to simply be, right? And so in my own work, I write about wrongs a lot. I write about wrongs a whole lot, right? And that's simply because I think we will not be able to free unless oppression anywhere and everywhere is annihilated, right? So that's what I'll say and stop. Thanks, Dhanya.
Thank you so much. A big thanks to John Boopalan, Christina Dhanraj, and Roja Singh. You all are talented, and thank you so much for taking the time out today to be on this panel. I also want to thank PC South Asian Arts Council and everybody that made this panel possible, and our host, Mimi Mandal. Thank you so much for your time, and we will see you next.
Thank you.
Thank you.